Not know, I'm doing my PhD in early Christian missions. So the area we've been covering the last month is actually the area that I'm trying to be getting my PhD in. So I could stay here for the whole semester and we would have a lot of fun, but we have to actually move on. Otherwise, those of us who want to know more about church history, we're going to do that. So what I'd like to talk about is today we're going to talk about how the church grew from roughly 1,000 people. Roughly on Jesus' death, there could not have been more than 1,000 Christians. Not more than that. Where in 325, the Emperor of Rome is convening a council in Nicaea and having a council in Nicaea because there might have been 10% of the Roman Empire that was actually converted, which is somewhere around the number of 10 million. So just to give you some numbers, the church grew from roughly 1,000 people to somewhere around 10 million people in about 290 years, something like that. It's phenomenal growth. It is not the most phenomenal growth in church history. Actually, interestingly enough, we're actually experiencing that in the last 100 years. The most phenomenal growth of Christianity has actually occurred in the last century and part of this century. Just to give you an indication, at current rates, China may be the largest Christian nation within the next 25 to 30 years. There might be more Christians in China by the year 2050 than there are people in the United States right now. That's just insane, the amount of growth that is. So we're not talking about the greatest growth in terms of Christian missions, because that's actually happening right now. What we're talking about in terms of the first century is the first big explosion. And Christianity has a tendency to jump. It jumps rapidly, and then there's usually this time of pause, and then there's rapid jumps, and then there's a time of pause, and then rapid jumps. So what we're talking about today is we're going to talk about how the church, what was it doing? What was happening from the time of 35 AD up until 300 AD? Does that make sense? That's what we're going to try to cover today. So what I want to talk about is Acts chapter 14, and we're going to try to turn this thing on. I should have done that first, probably. So Acts chapter 14, we're going to read, because I have it up here on the screen. Wouldn't that be awesome? If we could actually get it there. There we go.
Well then.
Well, see, it goes away. There we go. All right, Acts chapter 14. That's over here on the left. This is, over here is Origen's treatise, Contra Celsus. So over here is Acts chapter 14. So this is Acts chapter 14, 8 through 20. So do I need to blow it up a little bit more? It looks like it's kind of small. Is that better? Okay, can we start here with Clayton, and we'll just kind of go through. If you don't want to read, it's perfectly fine. Just look at your neighbor and bump them or give them a wet willy or something.
One verse at a time?
Just one verse. We'll do, let's do 2 verses apiece.
In Lystra there sat a man crippled in his feet, who was lame from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed,
and called out, "Stand up on your feet." And at that the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw that Paul had done, they shouted in Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down in us in human form."
Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was a chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them.
So when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Men, why are you doing this? We too are only men, humans like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth, and the sea and everything in them."
In the past, he let all nations go their own way.
Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy.
Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and left him outside the city, thinking he was dead.
But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe.
Okay, so there's a couple things in this whole text here that's really interesting. What do we notice in this text? It does apply to our discussion we're going to do today. What do we notice here?
It's Paul and Barnabas were mistaken as Greek gods
Yes, but why?
because through the power of the Holy Spirit and the faith that the crippled man had, Paul healed the crippled man, and people were like, oh, like, you must be a god because you healed him. And they mistaken what actually happened.
Well, the interesting thing about this story is that in Lystra, there's an actual ancient story about how the gods Zeus and Hermes came to the city and disguised themselves and walked around among the population, and the population missed them. Did not recognize them as the gods. And so they didn't get the proper respect that they were due, and so the city had itself fall under a curse.
Oh,
So
wow!
So that really kind of changes what's going on here.
Oh, no!
So what's going on?
We don't want to miss them
We don't want to
again.
miss him again. And so Paul and Barnabas, because this is part of their ancient tradition to have this. So Paul and Barnabas have this miracle. What you have is you have a miracle, and then you have a pagan interpretation. Pagan interpretation of that miracle, and then you have a refutation of the pagan interpretation, right? Don't do this. We're just men just like yourselves. And then what happens?
Stoning.
And then they stone him. Right? They stone him, and this isn't like pot. So, well, come on, that was pretty good. Right?
6 out of 10.
6 out of 10. All right, let's go. So what happens is they have this miracle. There's a pagan interpretation of the miracle. The Christians refute that, and then they stone them because because the Jews came and convinced them that they were sorcerers or something like that. This is actually an interesting part of the ancient world that we kind of can easily miss. It's really easy for us to look at this and say, these are ignorant people who don't know any better. But what are you supposed to think if you're from Lystra and a man who was paralyzed gets healed? Is that something that just commonly can happen?
No.
I don't blame them at all for thinking that, especially in light of that story. Like, I mean, honestly, I didn't really kind of blame them before, just because, like, that makes sense within your own thinking that that would happen. But after, in light of that story,
It's not an accident that they go to Zeus and Hermes. That's not an accident.
Yeah, no, like, that makes a lot of sense, and to me, it's like, oh, no, like...
Weren't there a lot of miracle workers, like, popping around at that time?
There were miracle workers. They weren't uncommon. The issue was, what is their source? And actually, there's a huge amount of data that we have on ancient incantations. They used to have incantations. For some of my New Testament classes, I actually get out some of the incantations and walk them through what that looks like. That was how you're able to control dark forces. And I don't mean dark forces as in evil forces. I mean dark forces as in powers that are larger than humans that you don't really know how to control, but these incantations gave you some access to them. So it was an ability to get a power that you don't quite understand to do something for you. An example of one of them was like how to have a person who wanted to fall in love with you, how you get them to fall in love with you. Another one was how to have good fortune in your workplace. There's a huge slew of them, of these types of incantations. Later on, as the centuries developed, about the 3rd and 4th centuries, you start seeing incantations with the name of Jesus in them. And you also see incantations with the name of the disciples in them. Which is interesting, because that means that what's happening if they're using a pagan incantation with the name of Jesus involved and the name of the disciples involved. What does that imply?
Becoming a cultural force. They're becoming relevant.
they think that by using an incantation, they can invoke this power that they think that Jesus was using and the apostles were using. That starts happening in later centuries, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. Then they begin to wane after Constantine, and you can guess why. Because the church actually comes out from the underground and starts teaching very publicly. But before then, it's very much word of mouth. The church is kind of kept underground. So we look at this and, in the 21st century, kind of go, oh, poo, that kind of stuff can't happen. But this actually fits the ancient world and how they thought about things and what things can occur. Is the apostles and Christians in general actually brought with them a power. And missionaries who go to different cultures can tell you that this is part of conversion in other cultures. Is they bring with them a power that that culture's gods either can't have, don't have, or don't have the ability to control. And then there becomes this confrontation. Now, what does the story tell us about the confrontation? Does it always end well for the believers? How could it end?
Stoning.
A stoning, because they don't like the refutation. There's a pagan interpretation of what's happened, they refute it, and then they are upset with them, and they say that it's not supposed to be this way. So here we find this in Acts, and this kind of a pattern kind of continues. Now, it's not the exact same pattern, but it's more like change the name of the city, change the names of the gods, change the names of the powers, and change whether sometimes they would all convert or sometimes they'd stone you. That was just as likely. But this is kind of a prototype. You can kind of see what begins to happen. So what I want to talk about today is how does this prototype play itself out throughout the next 300 years? Well, we're going to talk first about evangelism and then how the church was organized. And we've already kind of talked a little bit about religion in the ancient world. I'm going to start there instead because I'm kind of starting at the backwards end. So religion in the ancient world was this idea that there were priests. And we've talked about this a little bit, right? Some of you who were with me in early Christian or geopolitical times of Christ. What are priests in ancient paganism? What do they do?
They're the mouthpiece of the gods.
Certainly they certainly are the mouthpiece.
They're like the bridge between the mortal and...
Right, they're a bridge. Absolutely, they're mouthpieces, they're bridges. They're the controllers. They also control. They control how you get the God that you're asking for. They control how you have access to Him. So you might go to Hera's temple and say, I need I can't have kids. Help me out with my wife who's infertile. They didn't think it was the guy who was infertile. It was always the woman who was the problem. But because they didn't have that conception like we do. So my wife's infertile, why can't we have kids? And the priest would say, well, here's this incantation, and here's this practice, and you do this, and pray this prayer, and Hera will hear your prayer. Now, he's not giving you everything about Hera. What is he giving you?
Just exactly what you need.
Just exactly what you need. So the priest controls all of those different prayers. He controls all of those different things. Now, why would this priest give out all of that information?
People pay.
Well, sure, but he's not going to give it out for free. And he's not going to give you everything. He's only going to give you what you pay for. This is one of the things that the ancient priests did, is they controlled the information, and that's how they stayed viable. I have access to this information. You don't have access to the information. I'm only going to give you what you pay for. That's what priesthood was. And religion in general, religion had this function that it was personal need and public need. Personal need is, my wife can't get pregnant. Help me. Help me get my wife pregnant. This is my personal need. Your public need is, we can only stay an empire or a city or a family if the gods help us. That's the only way we can stay viable. The gods have to help us. So we have to venerate the gods publicly, because that's how we are going to keep their good graces. But we also can have personal needs. So this is what religion was. What's kind of lacking? What's kind of not here? What about a personal relationship with a deity? What's that look like?
You know, that's one.
What's individual loyalty look like to a deity? Okay. It's mercurial, like I'm paying you for this service.
Yeah.
There isn't any conception of personal, like you don't worship Zeus and Zeus only. Like that's not how it was done. Why would you, they would find that bizarre. How come?
Because there's different gods and goddesses for different needs, and
Right.
you have more than one need.
If you have more than one need, right. It's, to put it in a way that we can get our head wrapped around is, Christians in the early world were looked like people who said, I only buy Apple products. I only go to an Apple grocery store. I only go to an Apple accountant. I only go to an Apple car dealer. I only go to an Apple, what other kind of a thing?
Funeral home?
Funeral home, right? That's no, I only go to an Apple funeral home. What would we think if a person said that?
There are no Apple funeral homes.
Yes, that would be crazy to us, right? You don't just go to the Apple funeral home for when there are none. But that's kind of what it looked like. There were gods who specialized in certain areas. So if you wanted to worship, if you had a problem, that had, like you were a businessman who had ships that were going over the ocean all the time, guess what god you're going to really be interested in?
Poseidon.
Poseidon's going to be really interesting to you, and you're going to make sure that you have a relationship with, that you are fulfilling your obligations to Poseidon, that he doesn't get ticked at you. Okay? But you're not personally loyal to him. You're only loyal to him insofar as Poseidon helps your ships go. But if you're raising crops and you're doing shipping, you don't go to Poseidon for your crops. So there's no conception of this, what we would consider religious loyalty. And Christians came into this world offering a type of religious loyalty that superseded all of it. Now, why could Christians get rid of all this?
Because you don't pay God, and like in terms of like the personal relationship is there, and when you have personal relationships, you don't have to pay your friend to be your friend. You don't have to pay God to be your God, and like you give praise not because you have to, but because you want to, and because there is.
Well, sure, but yeah.
I was going to say, to tack on in front of what she is saying, could we say that that price has already been paid for you?
Okay.
Because Jesus died on the cross, you have to
Sure.
explain that, and so he paid the price for you to have a relationship with
Him.
him.
But what is the Christian's claim about all of creation? There's
God.
only one God.
Yeah.
And so God is what?
He's way more powerful than any of these others.
Because he's not God just of the sea. He's God of everything. And that's how you have to be able to communicate to them, is we have one God, and that God demands our loyalty. But he's not just in charge of one little area, he's in charge of all of it. They wouldn't have had the conception of necessarily forgiveness of sins. What you did is you offended gods by certain unhonorable actions. A great example is the story of, in the Iliad, where Achilles takes a couple of the virgins that belong to, I believe it was Apollo, takes some of them, and he violates them. And the god is upset that he has taken his virgins. He's not really upset about the virgins and how they're being treated, but he's upset that they were his and they're being treated dishonorably. So that's kind of how that worked. The idea of morality was actually kind of a human idea. The idea that the gods cared necessarily how humans treated one another only mattered insofar as whether that person was a good follower of them or not. And you can see that all through the ancient literature, is that's kind of how that worked. Well, the church comes into all of this. And what do the pastors, what do the bishops offer that's different? What does Paul do here with this crippled man?
They say, well, you don't need to go to the priest anymore. You have direct access to this power.
This power. And they don't say they don't get paid for it. What was their payment? There isn't any. There's no payment involved. The bishops freely gave, because who said, freely you have received, freely you give. That was Jesus' proclamation to them, right? You got freely, so you give freely. And so the bishops did not act as a bridge in terms of controlling information or power or access. They would teach what? They would teach everybody the same things. They would teach everyone, if the more you want to know, I'll teach you. You don't have to get paid for it. You just come to us. So bishops, the early pagan empire had a tendency to think of bishops like they were priests. But they weren't, because bishops were not the mouthpiece of God. That kind of was a scripture. They were not a bridge between the priests and the God, because you could have access to this, well, through the Eucharist, which all you had to do was to be baptized. And you could participate in it. So they didn't control their information. They gave it to anyone who was willing to have it. So the Roman Empire kept trying, as Christianity grows, they kept trying to kill off the bishops. And they'd say, we've stamped out Christianity in this town. We've killed the bishop. Because in their mind, they have cut off the priest. The priest has been pushed out. And what do you think the Christians did?
They just appointed a new bishop.
They just appointed a new bishop, and the whole thing kept right on going. So Rome kept trying to treat Christianity like it was a pagan religion. But it didn't fit any of their molds. And so because they didn't play by their rules, they had their own set of rules, bishops were actually elected by the population. The church that was there would actually elect the bishop. Now that's a little bit later on. So how did they get to this point? Well, the way it worked was, and you can see this even here early on, right? What happened in Antioch when the Christians moved up to Antioch and they started converting people? Who sent them Barnabas?
Church in Jerusalem.
The church in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem sends them Barnabas, and what does Barnabas do?
He sits down and says, all right, tell me about your church.
Right? Tell me about how we got here. So Barnabas kind of becomes this model. What you have is you have a town that already has a bishop. Right? It doesn't matter what it is. You can pick Jerusalem, you can pick Antioch, you can pick whatever. And the way it worked is the bishop gathered around himself his own little group of followers. And these were the people that he taught. The newer followers were the ones who were not ready to be passed on. The followers who'd been around for a while, these were the ones who were ready to get passed on. So he gathered around himself followers. And they didn't have to pay him. He just taught them. If you were willing to learn and you were willing to grow, you could come and sit under a bishop and learn from him. This is really early on. So the bishops had one of these guys, and what you had is you had the normal population. This is the church, right? So you have the church, and you have a bishop that's connected over top of it. Well, people move. They don't stay in the same spot. So-and-so gets a new job in another town. So-and-so has started a new business over there, and he's asking his son to go start it up. This is how it works. So a set of believers here would go to a different town, and guess what these believers would do?
Proselytize.
Now watch, I actually got a letter from, it's a work by Origen of Caesarea, who is refuting a guy by the name of Celsus, who writes around 170. He actually gives us a description of what it was like for people to try to convert them, who they were converting. Celsus, against Celsus, he says this is right over here. But as Celsus delights to heap up calamities against us, and in addition to those of which he has already uttered, he added others. Let us examine also these and see whether it be the Christians or Celsus who has reason to be ashamed of what he says. He asserts. Now what he's getting ready to say is he's going to describe what it was like, how Christians were actually doing the converting. It were these people who were doing the converting, not these guys. It was actually the lay people. Watch what he says. We see indeed in private houses workers in wool and leather and fullers and persons of the most uninterested and rustic character, not venturing to utter a word in the presence of their elders and wiser masters, but when they got hold of the children privately and certain women as ignorant as themselves, they poured forth wonderful statements to the effect that they ought not to give heed to their fathers and to their teachers, but should obey them, that the former are foolish and stupid, and neither know nor can perform anything that is really good, being preoccupied with empty trifles, that they alone know how men ought to live, and that if the children obey them, they will both be happy themselves and will make their home happy also. And while thus speaking, they see one of the instructors of youth approaching, or one of the more intelligent class, or even the father himself, the more timid among them become afraid, while the more forward incite the children to throw off the yoke, whispering that in the presence of the fathers and teachers, they neither will nor can explain to them any good thing, seeing they turn away with aversion from the silliness and stupidity of such persons as being altogether corrupt and far advanced in wickedness, and has been inflicted a punishment upon them. But if they wish to avail themselves of their aid, they must leave their fathers and their instructors and go with the women and their playfellows to the women's apartments, or to the leather shops, or the fuller shops, that they may attain to perfection, and by words like these they gain them over. In other words, who's doing the converting?
All these dirty peasants are converting these aristocratic children who are supposed to have upstanding fathers and teachers.
Absolutely. And now Celsus has got, there's a lot of polemics in here. You can hear that, right? Like he's saying you are these stupid, uneducated people. They don't talk to actually educated people to try to win them over. They actually only talk to children. And those are the ones that they try to win over. Or stupid people, or people who don't have any kind of understanding. Does this sound familiar? Like, have we ever heard anyone say that only stupid people become Christians? Is that something that we hear today? Or have heard today? This is not an old claim, guys. This is not an old claim. This goes back to the 170s. Only stupid people follow Jesus.
When you target stupid people for your evangelism. If you see someone intelligent, you just look the other way.
Mm-hmm.
But that you specifically try to manipulate people.
Mm-hmm. You have to look behind the polemics to get to, yeah.
I give you an up-to-date, for real, one of our missionaries in a European country was having children's meeting, youth meetings, and the driver of these kids could not take them back home to their village, and so they had them go onto the bus. Now we're talking about maybe 20 kids that came from a far-off place.
Sure.
And when they got on the bus, they found out, and then the next week rolled around, and none of those kids came back. And maybe the second week, there was only one child came, and so they asked him, where's everybody else at? They said, well, the bus driver said, what are you guys doing here? And I said, well, it's a Christian meeting, we're learning about the Bible. And he says, no, you are Muslim. You are not going to go back to that place again. And it was interesting that the next week, 2 little boys showed up, and they had a Quran in their hand, and our missionary took a picture of them. They were doing crafts, and they had a portion of the Quran hanging right there, and they were doing the Wordless Bible book study, with the color sheets and stuff.
Yeah.
But very real, you are Muslim, you're not to go there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And if, once again, children involved here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in other words, Christianity appealed to lower class people. At least, if we're going to believe Celsus, this is who we're... Now, we actually have a lot of very intelligent people. Justin Martyr, Origen, right? These guys weren't any slouches. So it didn't... Obviously, the existence of Justin Martyr and the existence of Origen meant only stupid people converted. Like, obviously, that's not the case. But that's part of his polemic. And what he's telling us is that Christianity permeated very, very far down to the lowest classes of people. And these are the people who would move to a new area, to a new town, and they would start converting people. People among their own classes, lower class people. The idea when he says that they're elders and they're betters, what he's saying is that in that society, it was a very top-down approach. You did what people who were smarter than you told you to do. And that's what you followed. You followed what your betters told you to do. Now, we are not trained like that at all. We're all told, all of us have to think for ourselves. Even the guy who's the ditch digger, right? We're all told, think for yourselves. In that culture, you weren't. You do what your betters tell you to do. And that's essentially what he's complaining about. These people aren't doing what their betters tell them to do. They're doing kind of what their own conscience says to do. And so they win them over, and then before too long, what you end up with is 10, 15, 20, 30 people. And guess what they do? They then write back to where they had been believers before. And they say, hey, we've got 15, 20 people here. We're ready for a bishop. So how did the bishop send them, how did the bishop send them one? How did they get a new bishop? They take one of the trained ones and they say, you're ready. You have learned enough, you're ready to go be a bishop. And that's how you get a bishop. And guess what he does?
The same thing.
He does the exact same thing. The bishop gathers around himself. Now, this is the model of how the church progresses for the first 300 years. This is what it looks like. Now, there's a modification to this as you get catechetical schools. Catechetical schools, Justin Martyr probably started one in Rome. Origen definitely had one in Caesarea. There were catechetical schools where you could pay, and you'd have very brilliant teachers like Clement of Alexandria or Origen of Caesarea, and they would teach you, and then they would go off and be elected a bishop at that bishopric. That's as it developed later on, is because these catechetical schools gave them kind of a population to pull from, a farm, right? We know of such a guy who actually learned under Origen. His name was Gregory Thaumaturgus. He was from Neo-Caesarea. And he taught very much in this manner. It was taught by Origen at the catechetical school, went to Neo-Caesarea, and apparently he was involved with all kinds of healings. And the saying said, when Gregory showed up in Neo-Caesarea, there were 17 believers. When he left, when he died, there were 17 pagans. So that was the power that Gregory had. He was a bishop. And he was a bishop who had learned in the catechetical schools, gone to Neo-Caesarea, and started doing things that were in relationship to this. This is kind of how the early church grew. No one wants to admit it, but in this culture, with these kind of beliefs and these kind of powers, what we would consider maybe superstitious, I don't know that that's a fair term to use, but that would be the term our culture would use, a superstitious culture. You don't win them over by not doing things that they expect. That's not how you win them over. You don't come in with all these grand arguments. They're like, you got to produce. You're going to show power before we're going to abandon gods who have shown, at least for us, sufficient power. So that was one of their approaches, was wonder workers and miracles. And there's a lot of them, and I mean a lot of them. There's a lot of stories of Christians who were doing all kinds of things. Gregory Thaumaturgus is just one of the guys who was doing these types of things.
So much so that thaumaturgy to this day in some games is a word for magic.
Yeah.
Like in Dungeons and Dragons, there's a spell called thaumaturgy where you basically perform miracles and make sounds come out of nothing and,
Yes.
sparkling lights and things like that.
Yeah, well, in Greek it means wonder worker.
Yeah.
So that was his name. He had done so much of that he was considered a wonder worker. But you also get things, so you get miracles that are one. Miracles are one, and then you get, let's see if we can go here. You get Justin Martyr here, who's writing apologies, who are doing, you don't need to read all this, but Justin Martyr who's doing apologetics. Apologetics and miracles. So there's intellectual arguments that the apologists are giving to the ancient pagan world. And then you have the local bishops who aren't educated enough, but they're giving these wonders, these powers, these power confrontations in the ancient world. And that is going to lead you to a lot of opportunities. Because if you have the intellectual chops to be able to hang with Justin Martyr and Origen and all those guys, they're able to help reason this out. And then when you throw the miracles on top of it, what are you doing with this?
You don't just have the words, you have the actions to back it up.
Yeah. There's one last thing that I want to talk about. A guy by the name of Rodney Stark, who's just been writing in the last 20 years. He talks about the role of community in this, the role of the Christian community. And what he argues, and he makes a pretty decent case for it, is that Christians had a different response to the multiple plagues and outbreaks that happened in the pagan world. And, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but There were multiple outbreaks in the pagan world. Part of the 3rd century, which is 200 to 300, the 2nd century was actually filled with a lot of outbreaks. Smallpox, they believe, was one of the outbreaks that happened in northern Africa at Carthage. Roman Carthage, not ancient Carthage. Roman Carthage, smallpox is what they believe that happened it. And in that world, and Sean can help me out here a little bit, but in that world, if someone got sick, they start showing the symptoms of smallpox. The family didn't have a whole lot they could do about it, so it was just, out you go. And so they'd kick them out. Well, what do you think the chances of survival are a person who's lying in a gutter on a street with smallpox? Sean, what would your survival rate be?
Dismal.
Right? We're talking less than 1%, right?
Yeah.
People can survive with smallpox on the street, no food, no clothing, no nothing. Christians, on the other hand, would oftentimes take them in, or they would not kick out their own. They would bring them into a house, give them food, give them a bed, and give them water. What are your chances of survival with smallpox, with a bed and a food and water?
Greatly increased.
Yeah, I forget the number, but it's not, we sometimes think of this as a death sentence,
Yes.
but it was because of their situation it was a death sentence, but
Yes.
it's not, people survived it.
Right, it's somewhere like a third die from smallpox, which is terrible. But if you can increase your survivability from 100% of everyone who gets kicked out and is lying in the gutter to only a third of you are now actually going to die. Well, what do you think is going to happen if you have smallpox and you're lying in the gutter and some little lady comes along and says, "Oh, I feel compassion for you," and she's a Christian, and she takes you home, brings you into her house, and she gives you water, and she gives you a little bit of broth, and she lets you lay in her bed. Now, you're a pagan. What's the thing that you're going to ask? You were kicked out by your family.
Why are you doing this?
Why are you doing, right? Like, that is the number one thing you ask. And the person says, because Jesus has told us to care for those who are sick. What's the next thing you're going to ask when your brain isn't maybe inflamed?
Who's Jesus?
Who is Jesus, right? And then what have you done? You've opened up an evangelistic opportunity. Now, that person, let's just give a for instance. Let's say the person who helped you catches smallpox and dies. What is the next thing that you're going to ask?
What happened?
Why would she risk herself for this? Why would she risk herself for me to have me die? What has she potentially made there? A convert. And with a 2/3 survival rate versus a 100% survival rate, Stark argues, I'm not sure how much I buy it, but it's at least an interesting argument, that this Christian community and a commitment to the sick contributed greatly to surviving these catastrophes. The pagan world was essentially wiping itself out because it didn't have community and it didn't have a commitment to the sick. Where the Christian world had community and had a commitment to the sick, and even though it cost them, it cost them 2/3 less than it cost the pagan world. What do you think of that argument?
And I think it goes beyond even that person, because if I'm, as a father, if it's my daughter, and yet I'm making these tough decisions, I've got several kids in the house, and so we're putting someone out, and then they take care of her, even if she dies or doesn't die. I'm still kind of like, I've got good feelings toward that person.
Yes.
Why did you take them? So I'm having to make tough, gut-wrenching decisions.
Sure.
For the sake of my family, because that's all I know. And so, it establishes that in the community beyond just that person.
Yes.
The whole reputation of the Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, to me, that's a little bit short-sighted, because you're only thinking of the one person who gets healed, but, I mean, community, even in the ancient world, was still pretty huge, much bigger today than, like, back then than it is today, and so,
Sure.
like, people also would talk about it, like, oh my goodness, these people are taking in our sick, and why are they doing this, and so they would also be interested in that too. They wouldn't just
If we get blamed for the fire of Rome, that doesn't help.
Right, it makes things very complicated. But when you have the ancient fire of Rome, which were around 200, 130 years ago, from, when Cyprian's doing his thing, you've heard about what could have happened, but you're seeing right directly in your face what a Christian is doing for you. All the rumors that you have heard, what are you going to think of them?
they're not as reliable.
Maybe they're not as
That's not
reliable.
who I know.
That's right. I've heard of Christians doing that, but this is John, and John did this, and that's who I know. Absolutely.
But even if the person did die, then you so the question is, well, where did they go when they died?
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
Christians actually have the answers.
Right, it creates really this whole package. This whole package kind of gets brought in together. So power confrontations with a strong apologetic, like it's making sense of the world. And then you have this community that's willing to sacrifice for people that don't even belong to them. This is going to be, I mean, it's not a machine. It's not like this is every time you do this, it cranks out a Christian culture. No. But as far as we can tell, it's these kind of elements that is why the church was able to get to about 10 million people, roughly, by the time Constantine converts in about 312, and then 325 is the Council of
You know
Nicaea.
what's interesting is that it actually, like I was reading this book called The 3D Gospel, talking about the 3 different aspects of different cultures, where you have guilt, innocence, fear,
Yes.
power, and honor, shame. And those 3 things that you just listed there also like go along with the 3 different parts of culture in terms of the miracles is the power, fear. So that addresses that point. The apologetics typically goes along with guilt, innocence, because it's talking about like why you're guilty or why you're like you've been innocent in the blood, and the community is part of the honor, shame, and so like every single aspect of community and every of culture, and then also every single aspect of the gospel is reached in all 3 of those parts.
Well, I'd love to go on more. We didn't even have a chance to talk about honor and shame and some of the things that, like, I wish we could. Like, there's so much more we could do. But we've got to keep moving because, we got to get to the 20th century at least by the end of this course. So we have to move on. There's so much more that we've talked about. But this is kind of getting us to 312 with Constantine's conversion. This is kind of the early church. I'm not giving us everything. I'm giving us parts of it. What do we think of this? Kat, I appreciate your input. What else? What do the rest of us think of this?
Makes you wonder where the miracles went.
Exactly what I was thinking. Why do we not need miracles? And I don't mean, we still have miracles.
Sure.
I'm in Haiti and I see them.
Sure.
Why not here?
Why not here? What's different? I have, my theory, but why do we not see those here, and yet I'll see them there? Almost what we call blatant miracles. Things.
Sure.
Some things there's like we attribute to. This almost sounds blasphemous, but we attribute to God, and some people are like, really, that's just circumstance. That's just, and you can kind of see their point.
Sure.
And then there's what I'm call blatant miracles, like, yeah, what do you got? What are you gonna say about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think they're there. I think our culture refuses to acknowledge that they're there. Just a couple of years ago, I think it was 2010, we had a lady from the Wesleyan Church who was healed down at General Conference in the Wesleyan Church. This is 2010. It just doesn't get out. It's just not talked about. We don't talk about things that are happening. They do happen, but we don't talk about them, and they're not. And the world just won't accept them. And even if you put them on videos, they'll say it's all video faked. So seeing is not believing anymore. Yeah.
I remember like last fall you were talking about rationalism and critical thinking. Like, I understand those things that come across the world in waves of time, but do they hit different cultures at different times? And are we more immersed in that wanting empirical data for everything than other cultures, or is it the same?
Well, certainly, I think that's part of it. I mean, we're a culture that has been told repeatedly that if science can't prove it, it isn't so.
Well, if you can't repeat it, it didn't happen.
Right. If it's not reproducible. I mean, what's Mythbusters all about? That's what Mythbusters is all about. If you can't repeat it, then it didn't happen. So it's, but that's the way our culture has been taught. The problem with that is history itself is not repeatable. I think that's just the problem. You can't reproduce the sinking of the Titanic. You just can't. Did it happen? Well, if you can't reproduce it, can't happen. Well, they have to start making fudges, and that's just kind of how this goes. But yeah, our culture is very much into empiricism and in reproducibility. And that's part of why we don't accept the miracles. But I would argue that itself is even waning. New Ageism, there's a new resurgence in spirituality and paganism. This stuff, I don't like. This stuff is really base. Like it almost seems like it's a part of human condition. And the empirical worldview that we live in may only actually be a blip in time. Like in terms of history, you know, up until the 19th century, no one really, most people didn't think like that. It's at the 20th century with mass education and mass propaganda through education that got the large majority of American and Western population to believe it. But even that is beginning to wane.
Yeah, I know so many spiritualists who like do incantations and believe the power of rocks.
Well, what they're doing is they're going back to paganism, which actually we should be like, that's way better. I know that sounds weird.
It's easier to convert a pagan than it is to convert
An atheist. Absolutely, because a pagan at least is open to things, open to the unknown. An atheist is completely shut down.
I can talk to my pagan friend much easier than I can talk to my atheist friend.
Absolutely. That's why I'm like, paganism. We know how to deal with paganism, right? We know how to deal with that. It's the atheist who kind of has built up a whole series of tools. It's specifically designed to thwart you. Their tools have been specifically designed to thwart the Christian arguments and the Christian rationality. So I'd much rather deal with a pagan. So anyone else thoughts on this? All right, so next week we'll talk about Constantine and how that changes everything. This is the model of the early church. It's very grassroots, very grassroots. It's kind of just coming up out of the ground. And Rome tries to keep chopping it down like it's a tree, and it's not a tree, it's a grass. So how do you kill something that's grass? It's really difficult to do that. You can wipe it out in one area, but then suddenly it's back again. It's because it's grassroots. So after Constantine in 312 and his conversion, we'll talk about that next week, everything shifts. Not necessarily for the best, but it does shift. So that's what we'll hit next week. Let's pray. Father, we're grateful for what you have done in the past, and we're grateful for what you're going to do in the future. Change our hearts, change our minds, make us open to your word. Change our heart, oh God. We are praising you, we thank you, in your son's name we pray. Amen. Alrighty, so that's what we'll do next week.